The cotton fields stretched endlessly under the September sun of 1943. Hans Mueller, a 19-year-old corporal from the Afrika Korps, straightened his back and wiped sweat from his face, leaving a streak of Texas dust across his cheek. In his hand was an envelope, not an ordinary envelope, but one that contained something he had never expected to receive as a prisoner of war. Payment: 80 cents in canteen coupons, for a day's work, in enemy territory. He stared at the colourful script, confusion etched across his features. Around him, other German prisoners examined their own coupons with equal bewilderment. They had been taught many things about America, that it was weak. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. That it was divided. That its people were soft and its economy fragile. But nobody had prepared them for this. Nobody had told them that even as captives, even as defeated enemies, they would be paid a fair wage for their labour. The farmer who employed them, a weathered Texan named Jack Morrison, stood nearby counting out bills to pay the government, $1.50 per prisoner, the prevailing local wage. Mueller watched the transaction with growing amazement. This was not cruelty, this was not exploitation, this was something else entirely. Something that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had drilled into his head since childhood. The journey that brought Mueller to that Texas cotton field had begun 5 months earlier, in the scorching deserts of Tunisia. May 13, 1943 marked the final surrender of the Afrika Korps. Between 250,000 and 275,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their weapons after months of brutal desert warfare. They had fought under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, believing themselves part of an invincible machine. They had expected glory. They received captivity instead. For Mueller and thousands like him, capture meant the unknown. Nazi indoctrination had filled their minds with horror stories about Allied treatment of prisoners. They expected beatings, starvation, perhaps execution. What they received instead began at the processing centres in North Africa. Clean water, medical examinations, food, real food, white bread, coffee that tasted like coffee, meat. After months subsisting on inadequate rations in the desert, the sudden abundance was disorienting. American soldiers processed them with mechanical efficiency, documenting identities, explaining Geneva Convention rights, treating them not as monsters, but as soldiers who had lost. The contrast between expectation and reality created the first crack in the foundation of their beliefs. The Atlantic crossing deepened that crack into a fissure. Loaded onto Liberty ships, the prisoners travelled in conditions that exceeded what many had known even before the war. The vessels themselves represented American industrial capacity operating at scale, while the famous Robert E. Peary, assembled in 4 days and 15.5 hours, had been a publicity stunt involving extensive prefabrication. Even the median Liberty ship production time of 39 to 42 days in 1943 to 1944 represented efficiency Germany could not match. During the 2-week voyage, the prisoners observed casual waste that revealed deeper truths. American sailors discarded half-eaten meals that would have fed a German family. The ships carried radar and modern navigation equipment as standard issue, technology Germany considered experimental. Everything they witnessed contradicted the narrative of American weakness they had been taught. Arrival at American ports delivered another shock to their assumptions. Norfolk, Boston, and New York harboured industrial landscapes that dwarfed anything in Europe. Norfolk Naval Base alone sprawled across 4,300 acres, with simultaneous construction and repair operations that exceeded Germany's largest facilities. The prisoners counted dozens of vessels at various stages of completion, observing in a single day more shipbuilding activity than they had seen at any German port. But it was the rail journey to the prison camps that truly shattered their worldview. Unlike the cattle cars used to transport German troops and others across occupied Europe, the prisoners travelled in passenger coaches, seats, dining facilities, in some cases, sleeping berths. They could not believe it. Through the windows, America revealed itself. Every small town blazed with electric lights. Rural areas that in Germany would have been pitch dark at night glowed with illumination from farmhouses and barns. Factories operated on night shifts with parking lots full of workers' private automobiles. In Germany, car ownership remained a privilege of the elite. Here, ordinary factory workers drove to work in their own vehicles. The prisoners pressed their faces to the windows, counting cars, counting lights, trying to reconcile what they saw with everything they had been told. Hans Mueller, riding in one of those passenger cars, later recalled, "From New York to Texas, you saw the whole countryside. Cars driving, buildings lit up. I came to wonder, how did we ever think we would beat the United States?" The destination for most of these prisoners was Texas. The state received approximately twice as many POW camps as any other, eventually housing over 50,000 German soldiers. The logic was bureaucratic, but revealed America's attention to detail even in captivity. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required that prisoners of war be housed in climates similar to where they were captured. Tunisia's heat closely resembled Texas summers. Therefore, Texas became home to Germany's defeated Afrika Korps. Camp Huntsville opened in April 1943, the first major POW facility in Texas. Construction across 837 acres had taken nearly a year, with 400 buildings, erected to Geneva Convention specifications. When German prisoners marched 3 miles from the train station to the camp in spring 1943, they sang German military songs in 4-part harmony. Local residents gathered to watch, uncertain what to expect. They saw not supermen but ordinary young soldiers, dirty and defeated. Inside the camps, the prisoners found conditions that shocked them more than any battlefield. Barracks featured electric lights, indoor plumbing, and heating systems. Water treatment, electrical generation, sewage systems exceeded many German municipalities. Each prisoner received 40 square feet of personal space. Officers received 120 square feet. They had sheets, blankets, and enough food to satisfy hunger they had forgotten could be satisfied. The food deserves particular emphasis. Geneva Convention requirements mandated that prisoners receive rations equivalent to those of their captors' military. American soldiers ate well, therefore German prisoners ate well. Fresh meat, eggs, vegetables, milk, real coffee. Many prisoners had not tasted such abundance since before the war began. At first, they burned leftover food, fearing their portions would be reduced if guards saw waste. Only gradually did they understand. The abundance was not temporary. It was normal. Camp canteens sold cigarettes, candy, toiletries, even beer in some facilities. The prisoners pooled their beer coupons to take turns, consuming several at once. They ordered items from Sears, Roebuck, and Montgomery Ward catalogues. Luxury goods disappeared from German stores years earlier, now sat available for purchase by captured enemy soldiers. The cognitive dissonance was profound, but it was the work program that delivered the deepest psychological blow to their assumptions. By autumn 1943, American labor shortages had reached crisis levels. Every able-bodied man served overseas. Farms desperately needed workers. The War Department authorized a major program allowing prisoners to fill this gap. It was voluntary. Officers could not be compelled to work. Enlisted men could choose. Yet most chose to work. Boredom motivated some. The wages motivated others. And those wages created the moment that changed everything Hans Mueller thought he knew about America and capitalism and fairness. The system worked with transparent simplicity. Farmers paid the government $1.50 per day per prisoner. This was the prevailing local wage, what they would have paid free American workers in that specific market. The government kept 70 cents to offset program costs. The prisoner received 80 cents in canteen coupons. That 80 cents equaled the minimum daily pay of an American private, exactly as Geneva Convention mandates required. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The numbers mattered less than what they represented. For the first time in their lives, These German soldiers witnessed a wage system that functioned with fairness. They saw farmers pay a real wage to the government. They received real compensation they could spend on real goods. The transparency was revolutionary. The fairness was incomprehensible. Mueller stood in that cotton field holding his coupons and understood something that would haunt him for years. The Nazi propaganda about American exploitation and capitalist cruelty was backwards. Here he stood, a captured enemy, and America treated him more fairly than his own government had treated its citizens. Here he stood, behind barbed wire, with more economic dignity than he had known as a free German youth. The work itself varied across Texas. Prisoners picked cotton, peaches, and citrus fruits. They harvested rice, cut wood, baled hay, threshed grain, gathered pecans. Some worked on construction projects like the Denison Dam Reservoir. Others served as orderlies at military hospitals. In 39 Texas counties during 1944, 11,505 prisoners performed agricultural labor that saved crops and sustained local economies. The prisoners quickly learned that 80 cents purchased power beyond its numerical value. The camp canteens stocked goods German civilians had not seen in years. Cigarettes, rationed severely in Germany, sat in abundant supply. Chocolate, vanished from German stores, filled canteen shelves. Toiletries, writing materials, even alcohol in violation of regulations, but available through prisoner ingenuity. At Camp Huntsville, prisoners used canteen profits to order luxury items from catalogues. They purchased musical instruments, art supplies, sports equipment. They built elaborate fountains and theaters. They created newspapers and orchestras. The abundance available through their wages mocked everything they had been taught about American poverty and German superiority. But the psychological impact extended beyond personal purchases. The prisoners witnessed the broader agricultural and industrial system surrounding them. Texas farms in 1943 operated with mechanization that revolutionized their understanding of productivity. Single farms encompassed more acreage than entire German villages. Tractors and combines allowed individual farmers to cultivate hundreds of acres. Hybrid seed corn yielded double traditional varieties. Chemical fertilizers, desperately needed for German explosives production, enriched American soil in lavish quantities. Rural electrification had reached over 90% of American farms by 1943. In Germany, less than 20% enjoyed electric power. The prisoners worked fields lit by electricity, irrigated by electric pumps, harvested with electric machinery. Everything ran on abundant energy. Everything suggested resources beyond scarcity. Jack Morrison, the Texas farmer who employed Hans Mueller, represented this abundance perfectly. Morrison owned 300 acres worked by 2 men and machinery. In Germany, such acreage would require dozens of laborers using traditional methods. Morrison drove a truck newer than most German military vehicles. His farmhouse had electric lights in every room, running hot water, a refrigerator, a radio. His workers, when they had been available before the war, earned wages that allowed them to own cars and homes. Morrison treated the German prisoners not with cruelty but with casual friendliness that confused them. He invited them to lunch, he showed them his machinery, explained his methods, discussed crop yields with genuine interest in their agricultural knowledge. He paid the government their wages without complaint and watched to ensure they received their coupons without delay. This was not propaganda. This was ordinary American behavior. This was how the system functioned normally. Mueller found himself liking Morrison despite his best efforts not to. The farmer embodied everything Nazi ideology claimed did not exist. He was not weak. He worked harder than most German officers Mueller had known. He was not stupid. He understood complex agricultural science and business mathematics. He was not cruel. He treated enemy prisoners with more respect than German officers had shown their own troops. The friendship developing between captor and captive revealed another truth the propaganda had obscured. Most Americans did not hate German soldiers. They hated the Nazi government. A November 1943 poll found that 74% of Americans blamed Germany's government, not Germans themselves, for the war. This distinction, impossible under Nazi thinking, allowed for the fair treatment Mueller experienced. Other prisoners reported similar experiences across Texas. Farmers invited them into homes, local residents struck up conversations. Women brought water to the fields without fear. The walls between enemy and neighbor dissolved through daily interaction. The Germans learned that American propaganda about democracy and freedom was not entirely hollow. These concepts manifested in how ordinary people treated defeated foes, yet not all prisoners accepted these revelations easily. Internal camp dynamics reflected the broader ideological struggle. Nazi loyalists and anti-Nazi prisoners clashed violently. At Camp Huntsville in November 1943, these tensions exploded in a riot that sparked national news coverage. Hugo Kraus, a corporal who served as translator and was believed to have cooperated with American guards, was beaten to death with lead pipes and wooden boards by hardcore Nazi prisoners. Mueller, sleeping nearby, heard the attack. The murder crystallized a terrifying reality. The greatest threat to prisoners was not American cruelty but Nazi fanaticism. Even in captivity, even after defeat, the ideology demanded loyalty unto death. Those who questioned, who adapted, who admitted the evidence before their eyes, risked assassination by their own comrades. The murder led to reforms. Americans separated Nazi and anti-Nazi prisoners, creating special compounds. They began a formal re-education program, though they called it intellectual diversion, to avoid violating Geneva Convention prohibitions on propaganda. Prisoners attended lectures on American history and democracy. They watched films, read banned books, studied works by Jewish artists and authors. They confronted newsreels showing the liberation of concentration camps. Many prisoners initially dismissed the camp liberation footage as fake. Mueller was among them. "American tricks," he muttered when first shown images from Dachau and Buchenwald. Hollywood staged those bodies. But the details accumulated, dates matched, locations checked. The sheer volume of evidence from multiple sources made denial increasingly difficult. Some prisoners clung to their disbelief anyway, but cracks spread through the foundation of their faith. The transformation was not universal or immediate, yet it was undeniable for many. Hans Mueller later estimated that 80% of the prisoners he knew personally had become, in his words, convinced Democrats, not through propaganda but through treatment. They had expected cruelty and received fairness. They had expected poverty and witnessed abundance. They had expected exploitation and experienced the reality of wages paid and goods purchased. The Texas experience created cognitive dissonance that could not be resolved through Nazi ideology. Every morning, prisoners woke to hot showers and full meals. Every day, they worked for wages they could spend freely. Every evening, they returned to camps with libraries, orchestras, sports facilities, and educational programs. Every moment contradicted the lies that had shaped their understanding. The winter of 1943 brought a different kind of cold to German prisoners in Texas. Not the physical cold, for the camps had heating. Rather, it was the cold realization of what their government had hidden from them. Letters from home began arriving with increasing frequency, and the contrast between conditions in captivity and conditions in Germany became impossible to ignore. A prisoner named Karl Hoffmann received a letter from his mother in Stuttgart. She described the latest ration cuts: bread reduced to 300 grams per week, no meat for over a month, coal so scarce they burned furniture to stay warm. The Allied bombing had destroyed much of their neighborhood, but there was no timber to repair homes, no glass for windows. She was proud he was alive, she wrote, but she was also starving. Hoffmann read the letter in a barracks heated to comfortable temperatures. He had just finished dinner that included pork, potatoes, vegetables, and bread with butter. In his footlocker sat chocolate bars and cigarettes, purchased with his canteen coupons. The comparison was obscene. Here he was, a prisoner of war, eating better than his own mother in the homeland he had fought to defend. The letters created a cascade effect. As more prisoners received news from Germany, They shared information in hushed conversations. A father in Hamburg had died from malnutrition-related illness. A sister in Berlin lived in a basement because the upper floors had been bombed to rubble. A brother on the Eastern Front wrote of cold so severe that frostbite claimed more casualties than Soviet bullets. Meanwhile, the prisoners in Texas accumulated small luxuries. They played soccer on maintained fields under floodlights. They attended movies on Saturday nights, sometimes watching the same Western film for weeks until they could recite every line. They received packages from the International Red Cross. They ordered books, musical instruments, and sporting goods from American catalogs, using wages earned picking cotton and cutting wood. The psychological torment of this disparity gnawed at some prisoners more than others. Werner Schmidt, a sergeant from Bavaria, wrestled with guilt over his comfort. "My family freezes while I have warm blankets," he confided to a fellow prisoner. "My mother starves while I throw away food I cannot finish. How is this right?" But the question contained its own answer, and Schmidt eventually recognized it. The system that created this disparity was not the American system of paying prisoners fair wages. The system that created this disparity was the Nazi regime that had launched aggressive war, squandered Germany's resources on military adventure, and left its civilian population to suffer the consequences. The wages themselves revealed deeper truths about American economic philosophy. The $1.50 that farmers paid per prisoner represented genuine labor market value. This was not arbitrary. Texas farm labor shortages in 1943 had reached crisis proportions, with a shortfall of over 300,000 workers. Labor commanded value in a free market. Supply and demand determined price. The government did not dictate artificially low wages to maximize exploitation. Compare this to the labor system the prisoners had known in Germany. Under Nazi economics, workers received wages determined by state decree, often bearing no relationship to productivity or market value. Labor unions had been destroyed. Independent wage negotiation was forbidden. Workers labored for whatever the state decided they deserved, with loyalty to the party determining opportunity more than skill or effort. Hans Mueller, working alongside American workers on occasion when guards permitted interaction, observed another revelation. The black farm workers he met earned wages lower than white workers for equivalent labor. Some earned as little as white prisoners. The racism shocked him. Nazi propaganda had prepared him for American racism as evidence of democratic hypocrisy. What Nazi propaganda had not prepared him for was his own reaction to witnessing it. He felt outrage. Not because racism contradicted his beliefs, but because it contradicted the fairness he had experienced. One black farm worker, a man named James Washington, picked 3 times as much cotton as Mueller on his best day. Washington had been picking since childhood, knew the plants intimately, moved with efficiency born of decades of practice. Yet Washington's wage barely exceeded what prisoners earned, and he faced restrictions and indignities that prisoners did not. Mueller found himself thinking thoughts that would have gotten him killed in Germany. "These people were so exploited," he later recalled. "The blacks didn't do much better than us. They were just in front of the wire, and we were behind the wire." The recognition of injustice against people Nazi ideology had taught him to consider inferior created profound cognitive dissonance. The re-education classes at Camp Huntsville took on new meaning against this backdrop. American instructors taught about the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the principles of democracy. They showed the gap between American ideals and American practice, then explained that the gap was exactly why democracy mattered. Free speech allowed criticism, free press exposed injustice, democratic institutions provided mechanisms for reform, however imperfectly they functioned. This nuance was foreign to prisoners, raised under totalitarianism. Nazi ideology permitted no gap between ideal and practice. The state was always right. The leader was infallible. Criticism was treason. Yet here was America, openly acknowledging its own failures while still claiming moral superiority. The audacity was bewildering until prisoners understood the logic. A system that could criticize itself could improve itself. A system that denied all failure could never reform. The agricultural labor taught prisoners more than re-education lectures ever could. Working Texas farms in 1944 and 1945, they witnessed mechanization that dwarfed anything they had known. The combines that harvested grain represented engineering sophistication equal to any German military equipment. The irrigation systems that watered crops used electric pumps powered by reliable grids. The seed varieties planted came from university research programs that treated agriculture as applied science. German agriculture relied heavily on manual labor and traditional methods. Mechanization existed but remained limited. The disparity in productivity was staggering. A Texas farmer with modern equipment could accomplish in a day what would take a German farmer with traditional methods a week. This was not a difference of work ethic or intelligence. This was systemic advantage created by decades of investment in research, infrastructure, and technology. The prisoners recognized that these advantages existed in a society that paid fair wages and enforced property rights and allowed innovation to flourish. Farmers invested in expensive machinery because they could keep their profits. Researchers developed better seeds because universities had funding. Infrastructure spread to rural areas because electrification served economic purposes beyond military needs. Germany had poured its resources into weapons and conquest. America had poured its resources into productivity and infrastructure. The battlefield outcome was clear. The economic outcome was equally clear. The prisoners, working American farms and earning American wages, witnessed which system generated more wealth for ordinary people. Yet, the cognitive shift was not immediate or universal. Some prisoners clung to Nazi ideology despite evidence. They attributed American abundance to stolen resources from conquered nations, or to Jewish financial manipulation, or to temporary wartime production that would collapse after peace. These prisoners resented their comfortable captivity, viewing it as an attempt to seduce them from loyalty. The hardcore Nazis created shadow governments inside the camps. They enforced discipline through intimidation and violence. They punished prisoners who cooperated too enthusiastically with Americans or who expressed doubts about German victory. Hugo Kraus's murder was not isolated. Other prisoners who fraternized with guards or who criticized Hitler found themselves beaten, ostracized, or transferred to special compounds. The American response to this internal violence revealed another cultural difference. Rather than collective punishment, authorities investigated individual crimes. They identified perpetrators, separated factions, created specialized camps for different ideological groups. The hardcore Nazis went to camps with tighter security and fewer privileges. The anti-Nazis went to camps with relaxed rules and more opportunities for education and interaction. This differentiated treatment confused prisoners who expected all enemies to be treated identically. But Americans made distinctions. They separated soldiers from ideologues. They rewarded cooperation and punished violence. They created incentives for moderation. The system assumed that people responded to incentives, that behavior could change given proper motivation, that human nature was not fixed by national character or racial destiny. Hans Mueller found himself in an anti-Nazi compound by late 1944. The transfer saved his life, he later believed. He had become too openly skeptical of German propaganda, too willing to admit American superiority in agriculture and industry. His fellow prisoners in the original compound had begun giving him dangerous looks. The transfer allowed him to speak freely for the first time since childhood. In the new compound, prisoners debated openly about Germany's future. Should the country embrace democracy after the war? Could Germans be trusted with self-governance, or did they need Allied occupation? What economic system should replace Nazi central planning? The conversations would have been impossible in Germany even before the war. Here in captivity, surrounded by barbed wire, prisoners enjoyed intellectual freedom they had never known as supposedly free citizens. The educational programs expanded in 1945, as Allied victory became certain. Baylor University offered correspondence courses to prisoners: mathematics, agriculture, stenography, foreign languages. Academic credits would be recognized by German universities after repatriation. Some prisoners took multiple courses, using their canteen coupon earnings to pay for books and materials. The irony was not lost on them. They were receiving better education as prisoners than they had received as German students. The courses emphasized critical thinking, independent analysis, scientific method, everything Nazi education had suppressed. The prisoners who engaged seriously with these courses found their thinking transformed in ways re-education lectures never achieved. Spring 1945 brought news of German collapse. Hitler's suicide, Berlin's fall, unconditional surrender. The prisoners received the information with mixed emotions: relief that the killing had ended, grief for comrades and family lost, anxiety about Germany's future and their own, but also, for many, a sense of liberation from ideology that had imprisoned their minds more thoroughly than barbed wire imprisoned their bodies. The work program continued even after German surrender. American farmers still needed labor. Prisoners still needed wages. The system functioned regardless of military outcomes. This continuity revealed something important. The fairness they experienced was not wartime propaganda or temporary kindness. It was how the system normally operated. Markets determined wages, laws protected workers, institutions functioned regardless of who governed. As repatriation approached, prisoners confronted choices about their future. Some wanted to return immediately to find family. Others dreaded returning to a Germany destroyed and occupied. A few inquired about emigrating to America, though wartime regulations made that nearly impossible. Many expressed gratitude for treatment that had transformed their understanding. The final months in the camps took on a reflective quality. Prisoners knew they would soon leave behind abundance for scarcity, comfort for chaos, clarity for uncertainty. They packed their belongings, which now included books and instruments and photographs and memories that would shape the rest of their lives. Hans Mueller packed his canteen coupons, worthless now but symbolically precious. He had earned them through honest labor for honest wages. They represented his introduction to an economic system based on mutual benefit rather than exploitation or coercion. He had arrived in Texas, expecting America to confirm everything Nazi propaganda had taught him. Instead, America had demolished those teachings not through lectures but through lived experience. The repatriation process began in earnest by mid-1945. Prisoners traveled from branch camps back to main camps, then to ports for transport to Europe. Many stopped first in France or Britain to assist with reconstruction, another irony not lost on them. They had destroyed European cities through war. Now they would rebuild them through labor, still earning wages, still treated with basic fairness despite what they had done. Some prisoners never returned to Germany. Approximately 5,000 eventually emigrated to the United States, having fallen in love with American women or American freedom or American opportunity. Thousands more returned to visit in subsequent decades. Heino Eriksson, who had been 19 when captured in Tunisia, became an American citizen and settled in Texas. He wrote a book about his experience, titled The Reluctant Warrior, Former German POW Finds Peace in Texas. The transformation he described was not unique. Across the American POW system, German prisoners had experienced a worldview shift that would influence post-war German development. They returned home with knowledge of American agricultural methods, industrial techniques, and democratic practices. They had witnessed a system that generated prosperity while maintaining individual freedom. They had learned that capitalism did not require cruelty, that democracy did not mean weakness, that fairness was not a sign of naivety. The skeptics, the hardcore Nazis who never accepted what they had seen, returned to Germany bitter and resentful. But they were a minority. Most prisoners recognized, however reluctantly, that they had witnessed something important. American industrial democracy had defeated German militarism not just on the battlefield, but in the contest of systems. The proof was not in propaganda, but in paychecks. The 80 cents per day in canteen coupons represented more than compensation for labor. It represented a philosophy of governance. that even enemies deserved fair treatment, that workers deserved fair wages, that markets should determine value, not state decree, that prosperity came from productivity, not conquest, that systems mattered more than slogans. Texas farmers who had employed German prisoners often maintained relationships after the war. They exchanged letters. Some visited Germany during Reconstruction. A few employed former prisoners who returned to America as immigrants. The relationships demonstrated that shared economic interests could overcome wartime enmity, that cooperation benefited all parties, that yesterday's enemy could become tomorrow's friend if treated with basic dignity. The economic miracle that transformed West Germany in the 1950s drew heavily on knowledge gained in American prison camps. Former POWs who had witnessed American methods became architects of German Reconstruction. They knew that prosperity came from production rather than conquest. They knew that democracy could generate wealth more effectively than authoritarianism. They knew that treating workers fairly produced better results than coercion. The legacy extended beyond economics. The Atlantic Alliance that anchored Western security during the Cold War, built upon understanding developed in American prison camps. Former prisoners who had experienced American power and generosity became advocates for German-American partnership. They could testify from personal experience that American strength served defensive rather than aggressive purposes, that American prosperity benefited allies rather than exploiting them. The story of German POWs in Texas demonstrates the power of lived experience over ideology. These men arrived as enemies, indoctrinated with Nazi propaganda, convinced of German superiority and American weakness. They departed as witnesses to a different truth, not through coercion or propaganda, but through the simple act of paying them fair wages for honest work. Every canteen coupon they earned argued against Nazi ideology more effectively than any lecture. Every meal they ate demonstrated American abundance more convincingly than any statistic. Every interaction with farmers and guards showed American character more powerfully than any speech. The transformation occurred through accumulated evidence that could not be denied or explained away. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.